All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into a really fascinating and honestly quite charged academic paper today. It takes a deep, impartial dive into identity politics, state assimilation, and history within the Ethiopian state. Whether you're a longtime student of East African history or you're just looking to understand the mechanics of how nations build their internal identities, the framework these researchers put forward is incredibly detailed. We're going to break down their analysis step by step, so let's just get right into it.
So think about this for a second. What actually happens when your literal survival requires surrendering your own identity? It's a heavy question, right? But it's absolutely the perfect entry point for today. The authors of our source material present this tragic irony right at the center of their research. They explore this idea that, for a specific demographic, stepping into political and social survival meant actively erasing who they historically were.
Well, let's unpack this by looking at the paper's core concept, the Habeshanized Oromo. The researchers define Habeshanization as a process where individuals of Oromo descent surrendered their native culture, their Ada Oromo, to adopt the Abyssinian, or Amhara-Tigray, cultural complex. Now, the authors are super careful to point out that this wasn't just some passive cultural exchange or a natural melting pot. Actually, scratch that. It wasn't an exchange at all. It was a strict structural requirement. If you wanted to participate in politics, access the bureaucracy, or even just secure land in this centralized state, you had to forge this new identity. Unwritten rules basically dictated that without adopting Amharic language and customs, you were barred from upward mobility. It was a transformation born completely out of necessity. To make sense of this layered academic theory, we're going to guide you through four main areas today. 1. The roots of state assimilation. 2. The mechanics of erasure. 3. The burden of identity. And 4. Pathways to decolonization.
Okay, part 1, roots of state assimilation.
So the authors distinctly frame the historical formation of the Ethiopian state as a form of settler colonialism. We're looking at the late 19th century here, during the state expansion under Menelik II. Now, unlike the traditional European colonialism you might be used to hearing about, the authors describe an Abyssinian state that used the Neftanya Gabar system. To put it simply, this was a garrison settlement system. Armed settlers from the north were stationed in newly conquered southern territories, and they were granted the right to extract labor and tribute from local farmers. You can imagine how this fundamentally altered the landscape, right? It totally facilitated land alienation and forced assimilation. Then, rolling into the mid-20th century, the paper notes this whole process was consolidated by imposing the Orthodox Church and making the Amharic language the absolute unquestioned vehicle for any kind of social mobility. Moving right along to part 2, the mechanics of erasure. How did the state actually enforce this? Well, the paper argues they weaponized 3 specific tools to push generations of Oromo toward Amharic culture. Step 1, political clientelism. The state basically incentivized becoming Habesha. Want access to the military, the bureaucracy, or land ownership, that was your cost of admission. Step 2 was religious conversion, which tied your social standing directly to the Orthodox Church. And step 3, which the authors highlight as absolutely pivotal, was linguistic alienation. In urban centers, the native tongue, Afan Oromo, was intensely stigmatized. It was literally branded as a badge of backwardness, forcing folks to abandon it just to chase the survival and prestige offered by the Amharic language. Which brings us to part 3, the burden of identity. This is where we see a massive structural dissonance. On one hand, you have the Oromo national interest, a movement actively demanding sovereignty and self-determination. But on the other hand, you have the state's national unity narrative. The researchers argue that the central state uses these assimilated Habeshanized Oromo elites as a literal buffer class. Because these elites sit in middle management and key political roles, they give the state this veneer of national unity. So when the liberation movement demands sovereignty, the state deploys this exact buffer class to argue against what they label ethnic politics, essentially trying to frame the struggle for self-determination as inherently divisive.
But here is the absolute kicker, the psychological toll. The authors lean heavily on the political philosopher Frantz Fanon and his framework of internalized colonialism. As the paper posits, the deepest resistance to the Oromo national project actually comes from a colonized mindset. The Habeshanized Oromo have internalized this narrative that they are civilized precisely because they abandoned their Oromo identity. To bring this down to a human level, accepting Oromo nationalism would require these individuals to confront a massive personal trauma. They'd have to recognize that their entire social standing is built on the erasure of their own heritage. That makes political change incredibly difficult on a deeply personal psychological level.
So what does this actually look like on the ground? It creates some brutal tactical hurdles. The paper outlines 3 major ways this assimilated cohort complicates mobilization. First step, fragmentation. You end up with Oromo pitted against Oromo in governance, which completely obscures the colonial nature of the central authority. Second, you see massive cultural erasure in urban hubs, especially Addis Ababa or Finfinne. Because the assimilated class holds the cultural capital there, they've historically impeded Oromo identity in the capital, treating the indigenous culture almost like an invader in its own historical heartland. And third, the adoption of Ethiopianism. The authors argue this concept is often functionally indistinguishable from Amhara hegemony, making it incredibly tough to mobilize a unified front.
Finally, we arrive at Part 4, Pathways to Decolonization.
So, how do the authors propose fixing this? Interestingly, they argue that true decolonization absolutely cannot mean just rejecting the Habeshanized Oromo as oppressors or traitors. You can't just push them away. They have to be understood as a product of immense systemic pressures. So, the solution requires profound reconciliation. First, through inclusive nationalism, meaning framing the struggle as one of broader human liberation so that these assimilated individuals have a pathway back to their heritage without facing total social rejection. And second, cultural restoration. This means systematically revitalizing linguistic pride and traditional Gadaa values. Gadaa, simply put, is the indigenous, highly structured democratic sociopolitical system of the Oromo people. By elevating these elements, the cultural cost of Habeshanization becomes way higher than its political benefits. Reintegration, not rejection, is the key here.
And that leaves us with one incredibly profound question to chew on. Until historical reconciliation is actually achieved, can modern identities ever truly shake off the lingering architecture of their colonial past? The authors make a super compelling case that this historical burden is going to linger until that internal division is actively, intentionally healed. It's such a thought-provoking lens to view identity and state building through. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this analysis today. Keep learning, keep asking the hard questions, and we'll see you in the next explainer.